The room was dim, the air thick with unease as Julia sat motionless in the chair, her dark eyes staring blankly ahead. The cold flicker of the fluorescent light cast ominous shadows on her pale face. She had come, not by her own volition, but because those around her feared something far darker than madness had taken root within her. Julia, a self-proclaimed leader of a secretive cult, claimed she was possessed by something ancient, malevolent, and far beyond human understanding. For weeks she had terrorized those close to her, her behavior erratic, her voices inhuman. Some thought her mad. Others believed her claims of demonic possession. But when she began speaking in languages she had no knowledge of, words spoken in guttural Latin slipping from her mouth like a curse, those in her inner circle knew they needed help. Not just from a doctor, but from someone who could walk the thin line between science and the supernatural. Enter Dr. Richard Gallagher, a seasoned psychiatrist with a reputation for being both skeptical and thorough. He had faced countless cases of delusion, schizophrenia, and psychosis. Yet nothing could have prepared him for Julia. From the moment he entered the room, he felt something was off. Gallagher took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the unnerving scene before him. Julia sat, her head cocked slightly, her lips twitching as though she was conversing with something unseen. The temperature in the room felt impossibly cold, and yet beads of sweat formed on his brow. "Dr. Gallagher, Julia," he began softly, trying to gauge her reaction. There was none. Suddenly, her head snapped to the side, her gaze locking onto his with a feral intensity. Julia, in a deep, rasping voice, "You are not welcome here, doctor." Her voice was not her own. It was deep, guttural, like a chorus of voices speaking in unison. Dr. Gallagher's heart raced, but his face remained calm. "Dr. Gallagher, Julia, can you hear me? You asked for help." A low, menacing chuckle echoed from her throat. She leaned forward, her smile unnerving. Julia, in a mocking tone, "She asked for help, not us." Gallagher remained silent for a moment, his mind racing. This was no ordinary case. He had dealt with patients with split personalities and vivid hallucinations, but there was something about Julia, something far more dangerous. Her lips began to move again, this time in Latin, a language Gallagher knew she had no reason to know. Julia, speaking in perfect Latin, "Ego sum dominus tuus, noli resistere." "I am your master, do not resist." Dr. Gallagher's pulse quickened. He had prepared himself to dismiss this as a psychological disorder, but there was something different here, something otherworldly that sent a chill down his spine. He needed to know more. In the following weeks, Dr. Gallagher observed Julia closely, attempting to understand the full extent of what plagued her. He watched in horror as objects in the room would move seemingly on their own, chairs scraping across the floor, books toppling from shelves with no provocation. Julia would slip between moments of lucidity and episodes of horrifying possession, speaking in multiple voices at once, sometimes laughing, sometimes screaming in agony. One evening, as Gallagher reviewed his notes, Julia spoke in a voice far removed from her usual ones. Julia, in a soft, distant tone, "You think you understand, doctor, but you do not. The darkness watches you. It knows your fears." Gallagher looked up, his face drained of color. He hadn't spoken to anyone about his fears, about the nightmares that had been haunting him since he took on this case. How could she know? "Dr. Gallagher, what are you? What do you want?" Julia smiled, her eyes glazed with a knowing malice. Julia, smiling eerily, "We are eternal, and soon, doctor, you will believe." It was that night that Gallagher made the decision he never thought he would. He could no longer rely solely on psychiatry to help Julia. This was beyond him. It was time to turn to the church. It was time for an exorcism. Father Luis, an experienced Catholic priest, was brought in. He had seen many cases of possession, but as soon as he entered the room, even he was taken aback by the malevolent force that clung to Julia. Together, Gallagher and Father Luis would face something far darker than either of them had ever imagined. But the true horror was only beginning. The tension in the room was suffocating. Dr. Gallagher sat across from Julia, his pen poised over the notepad, though his mind was far from its usual clinical detachment. The woman before him had once been a composed, charismatic leader of a small but devoted cult. Now, she was a shell of that figure, possessed by something dark and sinister. From the moment she had entered his office, things had been wrong. There was a crackling energy about her, a heaviness in the air that made Gallagher's skin prickle. Her eyes, once sharp and calculating, were now wild, darting around the room as if tracking something unseen. Her lips twitched, whispering something he couldn't quite make out. And then it began. Julia's body jerked, her limbs twisting in a grotesque display of unnatural strength. She let out a guttural scream, the sound inhuman, echoing in the small office. Gallagher's heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm, scribbling notes on the erratic behavior. Suddenly, her head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing with an eerie focus. Julia, in a deep, distorted voice. "You're afraid, aren't you, Doctor?" The voice was not hers. It was deeper, layered, as if multiple people were speaking through her at once. Gallagher's breath caught in his throat. Dr. Gallagher, nervously. "Julia, can you hear me? Who are you speaking to?" She smiled. No, it wasn't just a smile. It was a grotesque contortion of her face, like something was trying to push through her skin. Her voice changed again, this time soft, almost seductive. "Julia," in a woman's voice. "I know what you dream about, Doctor, the things you don't speak of." Gallagher froze. How could she know about the nightmares? How could she know about the faceless figure that stalked him in his sleep since their sessions began? Julia, laughing. "Oh, it watches you, Doctor. It's coming for you, too." His fingers trembled. He glanced around the room, expecting to see some trick, some rational explanation for what was happening. But there was none. Just Julia, grinning like a predator who had trapped her prey. As he gathered himself, trying to push the fear aside, Julia's body convulsed again. This time her voice, sharp and cold, spoke in perfect Latin. Julia, in Latin. "Noli timere mors tecum est." "Do not fear, death is with you." Gallagher's eyes widened. He had studied Latin in seminary school, long before he turned to psychiatry. He knew for certain that Julia had never been exposed to the language. The words cut through him like a blade. "Death?" The words seemed to hang in the air, growing heavier with each second. "Dr. Gallagher, how do you know these things? Who is speaking through you?" Julia's head tilted at an unnatural angle, her voice now a low growl. "Julia," in a raspy voice. "I know everything, Doctor. I see what you hide, your fears, your sins." Before Gallagher could respond, the room suddenly grew colder, frigid as though the very air had turned to ice. The temperature drop was immediate, unnatural. His breath came out in small clouds of vapor. Julia's fingers curled into claws, her body thrashing violently against the restraints. Her strength was inhuman, far beyond what someone her size should be capable of. The chair beneath her groaned under the pressure, as if it might break at any moment. Dr. Gallagher, stepping back. "This isn't real. It can't be real." Suddenly, Julia went still. The silence was deafening. Then, without warning, her eyes rolled back into her head and she began to speak in a voice so ancient, so cold, it chilled him to his core. Julia, in a deep, sinister voice. "They all think you're strong, but I know the truth. I see your secrets, the pain you carry." Gallagher's heart pounded in his chest. His professional demeanor was cracking, splintering beneath the weight of what he was witnessing. This was no psychosis. No disorder could explain this. The whispers grew louder, circling him like unseen hands. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing deeper, darker. And then, as if reading his very soul, Julia leaned in, her lips curling into a dark smile. "Julia," in a soft voice, "would you like to know what your wife said when she died?" Gallagher's blood ran cold. He hadn't spoken of his wife's death to anyone in years. It was a private grief, buried deep within him, a wound that had never healed. He staggered back, his mind reeling. How could she know? Dr. Gallagher, whispering, "This isn't real." But Julia's voice, calm and sinister, filled the room once more. Julia, in a woman's voice, "She called your name, Richard. She begged for you." Gallagher's knees buckled. The air seemed to press in on him, suffocating him in the weight of the words. He stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape the nightmare unfolding before him. But as he reached for the handle, Julia's voice echoed behind him, soft and sweet. Julia, mockingly, "We're just getting started, Doctor." Gallagher slammed the door shut, his heart hammering in his chest. He could no longer deny the truth. This was no delusion, no mental illness. Julia was something far more dangerous, far more powerful. And whatever it was, it had no intention of letting her or him go. Dr. Richard Gallagher was no stranger to the bizarre. In his career as a psychiatrist, he had seen cases most doctors would label unexplainable. Patients claiming to be haunted, tormented by unseen forces, some driven to madness by their own beliefs. But he had never believed in the supernatural, not truly. To him, every so-called paranormal event had a rational explanation, rooted in the complexities of the human mind. Schizophrenia, dissociative identity disorder, trauma, these were the causes. Not demons, not ghosts, not curses. When he first heard of Julia, he assumed this case would be no different. The reports he received from her followers, A cult leader claiming possession, bizarre behaviors, speaking in unknown languages, sounded like the ramblings of a deeply disturbed woman, perhaps consumed by her own delusions of power. Gallagher had faced such claims before. He had successfully debunked many of them, but Julia's case would be different. It would test not only his skills as a doctor, but his very understanding of the world itself. Dr. Gallagher's office, initial meeting. Gallagher sat at his desk, reviewing Julia's file. There were strange reports, claims of speaking in multiple voices, objects moving on their own, and an unsettling presence that people said could be felt when she was near. He shook his head, muttering to himself. Dr. Gallagher, sighing to himself. Another one, probably a case of psychosis or extreme dissociation, nothing I haven't handled before. His assistant, Claire, knocked on the door, her voice unusually hesitant. Claire, nervously. Dr. Gallagher, she's here. Julia. Gallagher glanced up, noticing the unease in Claire's eyes. Dr. Gallagher raising an eyebrow. Is everything all right, Claire? Claire swallowed, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the door. Claire, hesitating. I don't know, doctor. There's something about her. I don't think I've ever felt like this around a patient before. Gallagher smiled, trying to calm her nerves. Dr. Gallagher, reassuringly. Don't worry, Claire. We've seen difficult cases before. I'll handle it. Claire nodded and led Julia into the room. As soon as she stepped inside, Gallagher felt it. The air grew heavier, colder, as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees. Julia walked with a slow, deliberate pace, her eyes fixed on him, but there was something off about her gaze. It was almost predatory. She sat down without saying a word. The silence hung between them like a storm about to break. Dr. Gallagher studied her for a moment, then cleared his throat. Dr. Gallagher, professionally. Julia, I've read through your case. I understand you believe you are experiencing some kind of possession. Julia's lips curled into a small smile, but her eyes never blinked. Julia, softly. I don't believe, doctor. I know. Gallagher's pen hovered over his notepad, his clinical mind kicking in. Dr. Gallagher, leaning forward slightly. Can you describe what you're feeling? What makes you think you're being possessed? Julia's smile widened, her fingers tapping slowly on the arm of the chair. Julia, mockingly, you think I'm delusional, don't you? You think you can diagnose me like your other patients, but this, what's inside me, can't be cured with medicine, doctor. Before Gallagher could respond, Julia's body jerked violently, her head snapping to the side. A deep, rumbling voice, one that didn't belong to her, erupted from her throat. Julia in a malevolent voice. We've been waiting for you, Richard. Gallagher froze. His name? How could she know his first name? He hadn't introduced himself yet. His pulse quickened, but he kept his professional demeanor. Dr. Gallagher, calmly. Julia, can you hear me? The voice that came from Julia was not her own. Julia, in the same sinister voice. She can't hear you now. She belongs to us. Suddenly, a small object, a pen on his desk, began to slide across the surface, moving slowly but deliberately. Gallagher stared at it in disbelief. His rational mind screamed that it was impossible. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and picked up the pen. It was ice cold to the touch. Julia's eyes rolled back, and she slumped forward, breathing heavily as if she had just run a marathon. When she spoke again, it was her voice, soft, frightened. Julia, whispering, Help me, please. Days later, Gallagher's office. The strange occurrences only grew worse in the following days. Julia's behavior became more erratic. Gallagher, initially skeptical, was now witnessing things he couldn't explain. Objects moving, voices speaking from Julia that were not her own, and an eerie knowledge of events she had no possible way of knowing. In one session, as Gallagher asked her routine questions, Julia's demeanor shifted once more. Julia, in a deeper voice, You're wasting your time, doctor. Gallagher, keeping his composure, responded calmly. Dr. Gallagher, and why is that? Julia's eyes darkened, a cold smile creeping across her face. Julia, in the same voice, Because we know everything. You can't hide from us. Suddenly the lights flickered. A gust of cold air swept through the room, though no windows were open. Gallagher stood up, feeling a weight pressing down on him, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Dr. Gallagher, quietly, What are you? Julia laughed, a chilling, echoing sound that filled the room. Julia, smiling darkly, We are Legion, doctor. We've been with her for years, and now we're with you. Gallagher's mind raced. The temperature in the room dropped even further, his breath visible in the cold air. He had always believed there was a scientific explanation for everything, but this defied reason. The church involvement. Finally, after weeks of terrifying encounters, Gallagher made a decision he never thought he would. He reached out to Father Luis, an experienced Catholic priest known for handling exorcisms. It went against everything Gallagher believed in, but Julia's case had become something far beyond his expertise. Father Luis, calmly, "Dr. Gallagher, I understand your hesitation, but there are forces in this world that even science cannot explain." Gallagher nodded, his mind still struggling to reconcile what he had witnessed. Dr. Gallagher, reluctantly, "I just want to help her. I've tried everything I know, but this is something else." The priest placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Father Luis, firmly, "We'll face this together, doctor, but be warned. Once you step into this world, there's no turning back." Gallagher stared at the priest, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision. He had always relied on logic, reason, science. But now, as he prepared to confront the darkness surrounding Julia, he knew that none of those things would be enough. For the first time in his life, Richard Gallagher was afraid. The moment Dr. Richard Gallagher crossed the threshold of Julia's case, the world as he knew it began to slip away, like sand between his fingers. His rational mind, rooted in science and years of psychiatric experience, rebelled against what he was witnessing. But there was no denying it anymore. This was no ordinary case of mental illness. This was something darker, something ancient and malevolent. Gallagher's office, late-night session. Gallagher sat at his desk, his office dimly lit by the flickering lamp in the corner. He had requested this late session with Julia, hoping to avoid the distractions of the day, hoping that in the quiet hours of the night he might find answers. But instead he found only terror. Julia sat across from him, her face pale and her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She had been growing weaker with each passing session, as though something was slowly draining the life from her. Gallagher cleared his throat, trying to focus on the questions, though the room felt unusually cold for a summer night. Dr. Gallagher, gently, "Julia, I need to understand what's happening. Can you tell me anything? What do you feel?" Julia's gaze drifted toward the window, though the curtains were closed. Her voice, when it came, was hollow, as if she were speaking from a place far away. "Julia," softly, "it watches me. Even when I sleep, it never leaves." Gallagher frowned, jotting down notes. He had heard patients describe feelings of being watched before. It was a common symptom in cases of paranoia. But something in Julia's voice, in the way her hands trembled ever so slightly, made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Without warning, a loud crash echoed through the room. Gallagher flinched, his eyes darting toward the source of the sound. The framed photograph on his desk, his late wife's picture, had fallen, the glass now scattered across the hardwood floor. Dr. Gallagher, startled, "What the—" Julia didn't move. Her eyes, unblinking, stayed fixed on the window. Julia, in a low voice, "She didn't leave. She's still with you." Gallagher's blood ran cold. His wife, her death was something he had locked away deep within him, a grief so profound that he never spoke of it. How could Julia know? He never mentioned her in any of their sessions. No one at his practice knew about her, not even his assistant Claire. His mind raced, searching for an explanation. Maybe she had overheard something. But no, this was different. Julia's voice was filled with certainty, a knowledge that seemed to reach beyond the natural. As he bent down to pick up the broken pieces of glass, the room suddenly grew colder, frigid. His breath came out in small clouds of vapor, and his fingers felt numb as they touched the floor. He stood quickly, his eyes scanning the room. The temperature drop was impossible. There were no windows open, no air conditioning unit on. It made no sense. Julia, whispering, "It's here, doctor. It's always been here." Gallagher's heart pounded in his chest, the logical part of his brain screaming for him to stop, to leave. But he couldn't. He was bound to this case now, whether he liked it or not. Dr. Gallagher's home, midnight. After the unsettling session, Gallagher returned home, but sleep eluded him. He sat in his dimly lit living room, his thoughts consumed by Julia's words, by the impossible events he had witnessed. The room was quiet, but it felt wrong, as if something unseen was lurking just beyond the edge of the light. He poured himself a drink, trying to calm his nerves. His rational mind kept searching for explanations, but the silence around him was thick, oppressive. He glanced at his phone, considering calling Father Luis, but decided against it. He wasn't ready to admit that he needed help. Not yet. But then the phone rang, unexpectedly. Startled, he fumbled for it, nearly spilling his drink. Dr. Gallagher, answering nervously. Hello? There was no voice on the other end. Only static. His fingers gripped the phone tightly as the noise crackled in his ear, and then faintly, a voice emerged from the static. Unknown voice, whispering, Richard. Gallagher froze. His heart hammered in his chest. Unknown voice, softly, echoing, It's all your fault. He dropped the phone, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The voice, it was hers. His wife's. But that was impossible. She had been dead for years. Shaking, he backed away from the phone, his eyes wide with disbelief. Suddenly, a soft creaking sound came from the hallway. He turned, the darkness swallowing the narrow space, but he could see nothing. The air was colder now, just like in his office earlier. Slowly, cautiously, he approached the hallway, his heart racing. As he reached the threshold, something heavy shifted behind him. A sudden gust of wind, though the windows were tightly shut, and the lamp on his table flickered violently before going out. Gallagher spun around, his eyes wide, but there was nothing there. Nothing he could see. Dr. Gallagher, whispering to himself, This can't be happening. It's not real. But it was. He knew it now. This wasn't a figment of Julia's imagination. This wasn't something he could diagnose or treat with medication. Julia's house, paranormal encounter. Gallagher had to see it for himself. Desperate for answers, he made his way to Julia's home late one night. Her followers, the remnants of her cult, had scattered, leaving the house abandoned. But the moment he stepped inside, he felt the weight of the place, the oppressive darkness that seemed to hang in the air. The furniture was overturned as if some violent force had torn through the space. Strange symbols were scratched into the walls, their meanings lost to him, but they carried a weight, a malevolent energy that made his stomach churn. Dr. Gallagher calling out, Julia, are you here? Silence answered him, but then, from deep within the house, he heard it. A faint whispering, barely audible, but growing louder with each step he took. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, as if something invisible was pressing down on him. The whispers grew into voices, dozens of them, maybe more, echoing through the halls, speaking in languages he couldn't understand. But one voice stood out among the cacophony. It was Julia's voice, echoing, Richard, you shouldn't have come. Gallagher's skin crawled. He followed the sound, his hands shaking as he approached what used to be her bedroom. The door stood ajar, a faint light flickering inside. Slowly he pushed it open. The room was in shambles, the bed upturned, the windows cracked, but there, in the center, stood Julia, her back to him, her hair wild and matted, her body shaking violently as she whispered to the darkness. Julia, hoarsely, It's too late, it's inside me now. Gallagher took a step closer, his voice catching in his throat. Dr. Gallagher, desperately, Julia, what's happening? Tell me! She turned slowly, her eyes wide and bloodshot, her mouth twisted in a grimace of pain. Julia, in a deep, guttural voice, You can't stop it, doctor. None of us can. Before he could react, the room erupted into chaos. Objects began to fly across the room, chairs and lamps smashing against the walls. The bed frame twisted as if by invisible hands. Gallagher stumbled back, fear gripping his heart as he realized the truth. There was no rational explanation for this. No psychiatric disorder, no diagnosis. The force inside Julia was real. The turning point in Dr. Richard Gallagher's involvement with Julia came when he realized that this was no longer a battle of the mind, but one of the soul. He had seen enough. Objects defying the laws of physics, Julia's disturbing knowledge of hidden truths, and the voices that whispered from the shadows. His carefully built foundation of logic had been shattered. What Julia was facing wasn't something medicine could fix. It was something far older and darker. Gallagher's office, the final consultation. Gallagher sat behind his desk, staring at the phone in his hand. He had spoken with Father Luis, an old friend and a priest renowned for his involvement in exorcisms. Gallagher had once scoffed at the idea of exorcisms, dismissing them as relics of a superstitious past. But now his hands trembled as he made the call. Father Luis, on the phone. Richard, you understand what this means. If you're asking for me, you're admitting this is beyond your realm. Are you certain? Gallagher closed his eyes, the memory of the last session flashing in his mind. Julia's body convulsing, her voice shifting between a chorus of deep, guttural tones, speaking languages that no one had taught her. He had never been more certain of anything in his life. Dr. Gallagher, softly. I'm certain. I've never seen anything like it. This is beyond psychiatry, beyond science. Father Luis, seriously. Then we act quickly. Time is not on our side. The church. Preparations for exorcism. Father Luis stood at the front of the dimly lit church, the heavy scent of incense filling the air. He was dressed in his ceremonial robes, a small vial of holy water clutched in one hand, his Bible in the other. Behind him, the ornate altar glowed faintly in the candlelight. Gallagher, visibly pale and exhausted, stood at the side, his mind racing. This was the last place he ever thought he'd find himself, standing in a church preparing for an exorcism. But the more he looked at Julia, the more he saw the inhuman force that had taken her over. She sat in a chair, bound with soft restraints to keep her from harming herself or others, her face shadowed by her hair. She'd been calm for the moment, but the tension in the air told Gallagher it wouldn't last long. Dr. Gallagher, nervously, "Father, are we really prepared for this?" Father Luis's weathered face showed no fear. He had seen things like this before, but Julia was different. The evil within her was strong, perhaps stronger than anything he had faced. Father Luis, quietly, "No one is ever truly prepared for what's to come, Richard, but God is with us. Have faith." A chill crept through the church as Father Luis approached Julia. Her head hung low, but a faint, unnatural growl rumbled from her throat, echoing in the silence. Her restraint strained as her body began to tremble, her fingers twitching violently. Julia, in a deep, unearthly voice, "He's wasting his time, Doctor. You can't save her." Gallagher's heart skipped a beat. The voice was not Julia's. It was something else entirely, something dark and ancient. He stepped back, his throat dry, watching as Father Luis took his place beside her. Father Luis, commanding, "In the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, I command you, leave this child of God." Julia's body tensed violently, and the church grew colder, as though an invisible hand had gripped the very air. The candles flickered, their flames shrinking as a deep guttural laugh erupted from her mouth, her eyes rolling back in her head. Julia, snarling in Latin, "Ego sum dominus, non recedum." "I am the master, I will not leave." Father Luis didn't waver, but Gallagher felt his stomach churn. He had heard Julia speak Latin before, but this was different. The power behind the words felt tangible, oppressive. He could feel it in his bones. The exorcism begins. The air in the church thickened as Father Luis began the ritual, his voice strong and unwavering. He recited the ancient prayers, his hands steady as he sprinkled holy water on Julia. But the moment the droplets touched her skin, she let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the walls. Julia, shrieking, "It burns! It burns!" Her body writhed in the chair, the restraints creaking as her muscles strained against them. Gallagher watched in horror as her limbs twisted unnaturally, her bones seeming to bend at impossible angles. Dr. Gallagher, whispering to himself, "This isn't real! It can't be real!" But it was. He could see it with his own eyes. This was no hallucination, no trick of the mind. Father Luis, forcefully, "By the power of Christ I command you, leave this child." Julia's body convulsed violently, and suddenly all the lights in the church flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the candles on the altar. Gallagher's breath caught in his throat as the oppressive presence in the room seemed to grow stronger, heavier. In the darkness, Julia's voice returned, low and mocking, the sound of it sending chills down Gallagher's spine. Julia, mocking in many voices, "You think you can win, priest? She belongs to us now, just as your soul belongs to the shadows." Father Luis didn't falter, his voice rising above the taunts, reciting the prayers louder with more urgency. The room shook, the pews groaning as if under tremendous weight, and Gallagher had to grip the edge of the altar to steady himself. As Father Luis pressed the crucifix against Julia's forehead, her eyes snapped open, glowing with an unnatural light. Her mouth opened in a twisted, agonizing scream as her body jerked violently against the restraints. The air around them seemed to ripple, as though reality itself was being torn apart. Julia, screaming in a distorted voice, "I will never leave! She is mine!" The final confrontation. Gallagher's heart raced as he watched the battle unfold. Julia's body continued to contort, her voice a cacophony of shrieks and laughter, switching between languages, between personalities. Father Luis was relentless, his voice unwavering as he continued the prayers, even as Julia's skin seemed to burn under the crucifix, smoke rising from her forehead. Suddenly the chaos reached its peak. Julia's body arched back violently, her mouth wide open in a silent scream, and then silence. The shaking stopped, the cold air began to lift, and for a moment the room was still. Father Luis lowered the crucifix, his breathing heavy, sweat dripping down his face. Dr. Gallagher, hoarsely, "Is it over?" Father Luis didn't answer immediately. He watched Julia carefully, his eyes filled with cautious hope. Slowly, Julia's body relaxed, her head falling forward, her breathing slow and labored. The presence that had filled the church seemed to dissipate, leaving behind only the lingering scent of burning incense. Gallagher approached her cautiously, his heart still pounding in his chest. "Dr. Gallagher," softly. "Julia, can you hear me?" For a moment there was nothing. But then slowly she lifted her head. Her eyes, once clouded with darkness, were clear again, though filled with exhaustion. She looked at Gallagher, her voice weak but her own. Julia whispering, "Doctor, is it really over?" Gallagher let out a shaky breath, unsure if the nightmare had truly ended. But for the first time in months, Julia looked like herself again. A broken, battered soul, but free. Father Luis nodded solemnly, though his face was grim. Father Luis, quietly, "It's over for now." The aftermath of Julia's exorcism left more than a lingering chill in the air. It sparked a profound shift in how those who had witnessed it would view the world and themselves. Dr. Richard Gallagher, once a man of pure science, stood at the crossroads between the realms of psychiatry and the paranormal, haunted not just by what he had seen, but by what he couldn't explain. Gallagher's office, weeks after the exorcism. Gallagher sat at his desk, papers strewn across the surface, but his focus was elsewhere. His mind raced with memories of Julia's haunting, of her body contorted unnaturally, the sound of her voice twisting between personalities and languages. He had written dozens of case files in his career, detailing mental illnesses that seemed unimaginable, but this defied all understanding. He stared at a blank page, the pen trembling in his hand. How could he describe it? How could he explain the inexplicable? Dr. Gallagher, thinking to himself, This was not science, it was something else entirely. The soft creak of the door interrupted his thoughts. Father Luis entered, his presence a calm contrast to the storm brewing in Gallagher's mind. He removed his hat, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. Father Luis, calmly, "You're still struggling with it, aren't you?" Gallagher exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. Dr. Gallagher, bitterly, "Struggling? Father, everything I've built my career on, psychiatry, science, logic, it all crumbled that night." Father Luis nodded, walking slowly to the window, where light filtered through the blinds. "Father Luis," gently, "faith and science, they've always been at odds. But sometimes, Richard, there are things in this world that neither can fully explain. Julia's case wasn't about proving one right over the other. It was about acknowledging the existence of something beyond what we understand." Gallagher stood up, pacing the room, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Dr. Gallagher angrily, "I spent my whole life searching for answers within the mind. But what happened with Julia? That wasn't a psychological disorder. It was something evil." Father Luis, quietly, "Evil exists, Richard. Just as there is light, there is darkness. You've witnessed it firsthand. But that doesn't make your work meaningless. If anything, it makes it more important." The public debate begins. As news of Julia's exorcism began to spread, both the scientific community and the religious world were thrown into heated debates. Scholars, doctors, priests, and skeptics all had their opinions, but none could agree on what had truly transpired in that church. Gallagher found himself at the center of it, his professional reputation both bolstered and battered by those who either saw him as a pioneer or a fool. His name appeared in articles, journals, and debates, becoming a symbol for the ongoing war between science and the supernatural. Reporter 1 on TV. The question remains, was Julia's case a unique psychological disorder, or did Dr. Gallagher witness something beyond the realm of science? Reporter 2, nodding. There are those who claim this is a rare but extreme form of psychosis, while others insist it's a case of true demonic possession. Gallagher's reflection. In the quiet of his home, Gallagher sat alone in his study, looking over his notes, journals, and medical books. They were once his anchors, his truths. Now they seemed incomplete. He couldn't deny what he had witnessed. Objects moving on their own, the voices, the knowledge Julia had no way of knowing. But he couldn't entirely discard science either. The intersection of the two was a battleground in his mind. He picked up the case file on Julia, the words blurring as he stared at them. What was she, really? A victim of mental illness? Or a host to something darker, something ancient and malevolent? Dr. Gallagher, to himself. Will we ever truly know? The impact on the world. Julia's case had far-reaching effects. Churches saw a resurgence of belief in the paranormal, with people seeking spiritual guidance for unexplained phenomena. At the same time, psychiatric wards filled with patients claiming similar experiences were studied, diagnosed, and often dismissed. The case highlighted the fragile line between the mind and the soul, between what we think we know and what remains a mystery. Doctors and psychiatrists debated the case in medical conferences, some using it as a cautionary tale about jumping to conclusions, while others argued it revealed how little we still understood about the human psyche and the forces that might influence it. Dr. Gallagher's last words. Sitting across from a television reporter in a dimly lit studio, Gallagher faced the camera. The interviewer had asked the question everyone wanted to know. What did he, Dr. Richard Gallagher, truly believe? Interviewer, seriously. After everything you've seen, do you believe Julia was possessed by something supernatural? Gallagher paused, the weight of the years pressing on him. He knew his answer wouldn't satisfy everyone, but he had lived it. He had seen the impossible. Dr. Gallagher, with quiet conviction. I believe there are things in this world we cannot explain, and that science, for all its brilliance, may not hold all the answers. Julia was not just sick. She was tormented by something far darker than we understand. The camera zoomed in on his face, capturing the haunted look in his eyes. He wasn't just a doctor anymore. He was a witness to the unknown. The legacy. Julia's case would go down in history as one of the most controversial and perplexing cases in modern psychiatry. It opened up discussions not just about the limits of medicine, but about the existence of the supernatural. For Dr. Gallagher, it was a constant reminder that there are forces in this world beyond logic, and sometimes faith and science must work together in the face of unspeakable evil.